Hi, I'm Matt Lupoli, and welcome to Percussion 101 with Mr. Lupoli. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Percussion 101 with Mr. Lupoli. On this episode, we'll be talking all about keyboard percussion, also known as mallet percussion or pitched percussion. So let's talk a little bit about what that means exactly. So the other episodes we did focused on the drum kit and hand drums. Now those instruments are primarily referred to as non-pitched percussion. So a snare drum, for example, no matter where you hit the snare drum with the stick, is going to make the same pitch or the same tone. It has no definitive tone, so to speak. But these instruments that we'll be talking about today, they do have definitive pitches and multiple pitches as well. These are melodic percussion instruments, whereas drum kit and hand drums are strictly rhythmic. You can't play melodic pieces on drum kit and hand drums, but you can play melodic instruments on pitched percussion. Now, I also refer to them as keyboard or mallet, so that means that these instruments are set up like a keyboard. So if you're familiar with piano, that's how these instruments are set up. They have keys that are set up just like a piano or an organ or a harpsichord or any other major type of keyboard. So if you're not as familiar with a keyboard setup, let's go and do that first. All right, so by no means am I a keyboard player or a piano player, but I do have a keyboard that I use from time to time, usually to accompany myself if I'm singing or for music theory purposes. But here is your basic electronic keyboard. This is not a true piano. A true piano is acoustic with movable parts. This one you would either call an electronic keyboard, or some people even use the term synthesizer. So it works sort of like a computer. You can make it sound like almost any instrument you want. It has multiple timbres, so to speak. But we see the basic keyboard setup. You'll see there's a lot of white keys and there are a lot of black keys. So let's talk about what these are. So these white keys are what we call the natural keys, meaning they're the regular versions of the notes. Now, one of the first things you want to do when you sit down at a keyboard is find where middle C is. So it's actually right here. And how do I know that this is C? Well, C is always going to be just to the left of two black keys. As we can see here, there's always a set of 3 black keys and then a set of 2 black keys. So any white key that's just to the left of 2 black keys, that is a C. And there's actually multiple C's on this keyboard, but this is the one that's right in the middle. So that's middle C. All right, so most of you who play melodic instruments, you know that notes in the United States are given letter names. The letters are A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Now after G, there is no H note, as I'm sure many of you know. It just starts over again. It goes back to A. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It just goes on and on and on forever. So once again, this is middle C. Everything is measured from this point. So then the one right next to it would be D, then E, F, G. Now after this, we said it doesn't go to H. It starts over. So this would be A, B, and then another C. Okay, so that will be called a scale. So another thing, we also would call this an octave because we went from one C to another C that was higher. So that distance of 8 notes, we call that an octave. Octave is It's borrowed from the word that means 8, like an octagon or octopus. So if I said play a C for me and you did this, and if I said no, play an octave above, you would go to the next C. Or if you played a C and I said no, play an octave below, you would go to the next lowest one. All right, so keyboard instruments, when we're discussing the range of their notes, we usually measure that range and how many octaves they have. So if we look at the very beginning over here, this note is a C. It's a very low C. Then count going forward. Here's another C. So that's one whole octave. Go to the next C. Okay, 2 octaves. 3 octaves. 4 octaves. 5. So we would say that this keyboard has 5 octaves of keys. Now, what about the black keys over here? Okay, we have a few different names for them. We sometimes call them sharps, we sometimes call them accidentals, and we sometimes call them flats. Any of those names are acceptable. So these are the notes that go in between the naturals, as you can see. So let's go back to that middle C. Now this black key that's over here, because it's slightly higher than the C, we're going to call that C sharp. All right, sharp means it's half a step higher in pitch. So it's C sharp. It's a slightly higher version of C. But we also call this D flat. Okay, why? Because it's a little bit lower than the next key, which is D. The term flat means half a step lower. So every one of these black keys, or the accidentals, they always have 2 names. They have a sharp name, so this is C sharp, and they have a flat name, so it's also D flat. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, you'll understand more of the terms that I'll be using to describe these instruments, because I'll be using words like pitch, naturals, sharps and flats, accidentals, octaves. All right, so now you understand what all those terms mean. Now, keyboard percussion instruments are very old. They're not quite as old as their non-pitched counterparts. They're not quite as old as drums, but they are still very old nonetheless. We actually see evidence of keyboard instruments in Asia going back as far as 4,000 years. And although they looked very different than the keyboard percussion instruments that we have now, they definitely evolved from those instruments. So the first mallet percussion instrument I want to talk about is called the xylophone. Now that word, xylophone, that's derived from the ancient Greek phrase, which literally means wooden sound. Evidence shows that xylophone-type instruments existed in Asia since 500 AD, and others were later seen in Africa. Mention of a xylophone-type instrument being featured in European music first appeared in the 16th century. The first use of a modern European orchestral xylophone was in composer Camille Saint-Saëns' tone poem Danse Macabre in 1874. popularity soon took off in classical music. It later became a popular instrument in jazz bands and vaudeville acts throughout the 1920s and 1930s. But as time passed on, its popularity was exceeded by the vibraphone in jazz music. We'll talk more about that instrument later. The xylophone usually has rosewood bars, but the bars can also be made from synthetic materials such as fiberglass or plastic. Most concert xylophones have resonator tubes underneath the tone bars to enhance the instrument's tone and sustain. And the range of a xylophone can be anywhere from 2.5 to 4 octaves of keys. The next instrument I want to talk about is called the marimba. Now, it's believed that that word is derived from the Bantu word marimba or malimba, which literally means xylophone. Now, that word Bantu might sound familiar to you. You may remember hearing that word in last week's episode when we were talking about hand drums. The Bantu people were an ethnic group from Central Africa, and many of them, unfortunately, were sold as slaves and came to the Americas, and they took their musical ideas with them. And some of the musical ideas include instruments like the conga, bongos, the cuica, and so forth. But they also came up with the idea for the marimba. Bantu slaves brought their marimba concepts with them to Central America in the 16th century. These ideas were later adapted by Central America's indigenous peoples, such as the Mayans. By 1821, the marimba was proclaimed to be the national instrument of Guatemala. Throughout the 19th century, Mexican marimbists made several changes to the instrument, including giving it a straight appearance instead of a bowed one, longer legs so the musician could play while standing, and replacing the gourd resonators with wooden ones. More keys were added to make the marimba a chromatic instrument, just like a piano. By the 20th century, the marimba was being used in vaudeville theater and comedy shows. One of the chief proponents of marimba in the United States was Claire Omar Muzzer, who later formed his own mallet percussion manufacturing company. The Muzzer Company was later bought by the Ludwig Drum Company and is now referred to as Ludwig Muzzer. The popularity of using marimba in orchestral music took off in 1947 when composer Darius Milhaud featured the instrument in his piece Concerto for Marimba and Vibraphone. bars are usually made of wood, such as rosewood, like on a xylophone, but they can also be made from bubinga or mahogany. Marimbas always have resonator tubes underneath the tone bars. This is the key to the instrument's rich sound. The resonators are usually made from aluminum. The marimba is easily the longest of all the keyboard percussion instruments. The range of the instrument is usually anywhere from 4 to 5.5 octaves.
In a laboratory once upon a time, at work was a doctor named Frankenstein.
Okay, next we're going to talk about my personal favorite keyboard percussion instrument, and that would be the vibraphone. The vibraphone is also known as the vibraharp or simply the vibes. A much newer instrument, the first one was made by the Lupoli Manufacturing Company in 1921. It was designed to be used by vaudeville orchestras for novelty effects. By the 1930s, it quickly became a popular jazz instrument. One of the earliest musicians to popularize the instrument was drummer-turned-vibraphonist Lionel Hampton. Even today, it is widely recognized as a jazz instrument, but it can also be heard in orchestral, chamber ensemble, and even solo performance settings. Vibraphone bars are made from aluminum bar stock. Like the marimba, the vibraphone always has aluminum resonator tubes underneath the tone bars. The instrument also has a damper pedal for sustaining tones, similar to a sustain pedal on a piano. Okay, here we see the sustain pedals, which I can operate with my foot. Now here's middle C without using the pedal. Okay, notice how the sound disappears really quickly, but if I hold down that pedal, the sound sustains. The instrument also has an electric motor that rotates metal discs inside the resonators. Okay, over here we see the electric motor, which I've plugged in. Let's go ahead and turn that on. All right, and we see that there are all these little discs inside of the resonator tubes that are spinning around. So let's see let's hear what happens if I hit one of the keys now. All right, did you hear that? That's what we call tremolo. It was mistakenly called the vibrato effect, and that's how we get the name vibraphone, but truly it's called the tremolo effect. Now, the motor actually has multiple speeds, so I'm going to turn it off for a second. I'm going to switch it to a faster speed. Turn it on. Now let's check this out. Yeah, we hear that tremolo effect is going much faster now. So certain pieces of music, not only will it say to either have the motor on or off, but it actually might even say what speed to set it on as well. All right, now there's actually a couple of other ways that you can get that vibrato effect without using the motor. One is a way that my old percussion teacher in college showed me called mouth vibrato, but it only works in the upper range of the keys. Basically, what you do is you hit one of these upper keys, and if you put your mouth over that key after it's been hit, after it's ringing, and open your mouth open and closed very quickly, it will make a sort of vibrato effect. Watch. Just like that. Now, another cool thing you can do with the vibraphone is that you can also bow the bars, so to speak. And I actually mean bow the bars. Now, here we have an actual violin bow, and even though this is used traditionally for a violin, you can use it for various percussion sound effects. Now, before you do anything, make sure that this bow is well rosined. So I have some rosin right here. I'm going to rub that all over the bow for some friction. Okay, so now I'm going to press the sustain pedal down, and then you gently rub the bow along the edges of the bars. And you get really creepy sounds like these. A similar effect can also be done on a cymbal, and sounds like these are usually used in science fiction or even horror films. The range of the vibraphone is anywhere from 3 to 4 octaves. Okay, the next instrument we'll be talking about is called the Glockenspiel, also known as the orchestra bells. Now, the name Glockenspiel is derived from the German phrase which literally means bell set. The instrument developed from earlier instruments that actually featured a set of pitched bells. Bell sets were used in Chinese musical settings as early as 4,000 years ago. By the 17th century, small glockenspiels began to be made with flat, keyboard-style metal bars. This new design made it possible for musicians to perform more demanding parts. The first orchestral composer to write for glockenspiel was Georg Friedrich Handel in his 1739 oratorio, Saul. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart featured the instrument in his 1791 opera, the magic flute.
Gewinnt oft viel, komm, du schönes Glockenspiel, lass die Glöckchen klingen, klingen, dass die Ohren ihnen singen.
Das klinget so herrlich, das klinget so schön, la 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 la. Nie hab ich so etwas gehört noch gesehen, la 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 la. Nie hab ich so etwas gehört noch gesehen, la 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 la.
The instrument's bars are made from metal. The range is usually anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 octaves. An upright version, known as a bell lyre, is commonly played in marching bands. There is even a pedal glockenspiel, which features a damper pedal for sustaining tones. Similarly to a vibraphone, it also has resonator tubes. A close cousin of the glockenspiel are the crotales, also known as antique cymbals. Their range is anywhere from 1 to 2 octaves. Instrument we'll be talking about today is called the tubular bells, also known as the chimes. The tubular bells were meant to imitate the sound of church bells, or a carillon. on. They first appeared in Paris, France, sometime between 1860 and 1870. 19th century composers began substituting tubular bells for church bells, including Giuseppe Verdi, Giacomo Puccini, and Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. The English progressive rock musician and multi-instrumentalist Mike Oldfield featured tubular bells on several of his albums, most notably the album Tubular Bells. The album became very popular when the opening section was used as the musical theme for the 1973 horror film The Exorcist.
Plus, tubular bells.
The instrument's tubes are made from metal, such as bronze. They are usually hit on the top edge of the tube with rawhide or plastic-headed hammers, not mallets. The instrument also features a sustain pedal, similar to the one found on a vibraphone. The range of the instrument is usually 1.5 octaves. There are even electronic mallet percussion instruments available as well, such as the Mallet Cat. It works very similarly to an electronic keyboard. It has the sounds and timbres from several different instruments stored on its MIDI database. That way you can make it sound like any keyboard instrument you want. A xylophone, a marimba, a vibraphone, pretty much anything. This has become popular recently with some jazz musicians, and also some rock drummers are incorporating this into their drum set setup so that they can incorporate more keyboard percussion sounds into their overall sound. I also wanted to talk about some of the mallets that you might use if you're a mallet percussion player. So let's look at these ones first. These are called brass mallets, and as the name implies, the heads are actually made out of brass. It's a very hard metal. Pretty much the only instrument I would use these on are the glockenspiel, because that instrument has very hard metal bars. Anything else like a xylophone that has wooden bars, if you were to use these, you would probably damage it. So these are mainly for the glockenspiel. Then over here we have some hard rubber mallets. Again, you can use these on the glockenspiel if you want a quieter sound. You can also use them on the xylophone if you want a quieter sound. And then here, these are rosewood mallets, and these are pretty much my go-to mallets for the xylophone, and it's made out of the same substance that the xylophone bars are made out of, rosewood. Then these guys over here, these are vibraphone mallets. So I have a couple of different types. These are a harder style mallet, so you're going to get a louder sound. Then these ones, they're a little bit softer. And then also these kind a little bit softer. So yeah, the hardness of the mallet will determine the volume. So you have hard mallets, you have soft mallets, and so forth. Then over here, these are the yarn mallets. So these are the ones I would usually use for marimba. And like, there's just so many different kinds of mallets. As you can see, I have a whole bag right here filled with all types of mallets and sticks that prepare me for pretty much any kind of percussion job that I come across. All right, something else I want to talk about is where exactly you should hit on the bars of the vibraphone or any other mallet percussion instrument for that matter. So the best place to hit is right in the very center of the bar. That's where you're going to get your best sound. And one reason to do it there is because right underneath there, directly underneath, that's where the resonator tubes are. You're going to get a really great sound. Now, if your mallets are going very quickly, if you're playing a really difficult passage and you're afraid you might not get to the center in time, it is also acceptable to do the edge of the bar. Not quite as good as the center, but it's not terrible. But the absolute worst place is right here. So you get kind of a dead stroke in this spot. That's because underneath here, that's where a hole has been drilled in the bar, and we have the long cord that's going through that's connecting all the bars together. And that's not just on the vibraphone, that's the same on the marimba, the xylophone, all of them. So you're not going to want to hit in this spot. You're going to get a terrible sound. So, bad, good, best. All right, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the different kinds of grips that you use when you're holding mallets. Now, if you remember from the drum kit episode, we talked about that there are two types of grips that you use when you're playing the drums. We have the traditional grip and we have the matched grip. Now, if you're just playing with two mallets, there's only one way to hold them, and essentially you hold them the same way that you would if you were playing a matched grip on the drum set, like so. So there's not multiple ways to hold this. But when you start using four mallets, that's when we see other types of grips. So the first way that you would hold four mallets would be known as the traditional grip, and that's like this. Now, this is not my favorite way, but this is what's called the traditional grip. Then my favorite way is what's called the Burton grip, which was invented by the jazz vibraphone player Gary Burton. And since the vibraphone is my favorite mallet instrument, this is the grip I use the most. And I find this very helpful. I think this is very comfortable to use. All right. There's also another way called the Muzzer-Stevens grip, and this way was invented originally by Claire Omar Muzzer, who was an early maker of marimbas, and then later it was developed further by the marimbist Lee Howard Stevens, so now they call it the Muzzer-Stevens grip, and that way it goes a little something like this. Alright. Now, when I first started using this grip, I didn't like it at first. I thought it was very uncomfortable, but I did get used to it. And the benefit of this way is that you could actually stretch the mallets much wider, and that's what makes this such a great grip for marimba, because the marimba is the longest of all the mallet percussion instruments. So you really want a grip that's you're going to be able to stretch really far on. And in recent years, some very talented marimbas have started using 6 mallets. Yes, 6, 3 in each hand. Now, I've never done this myself, but I have studied what the grip is. And that looks a little something like this. So 3 in each hand. But I think those people are a little bit insane. If they can do it, that's great. But I see no reason why I would ever have to have 6 mallets. If you're really serious about playing mallet percussion instruments yourself, then here's a compilation I put together of some of the best mallet percussion players that have ever worked in the business. But you don't have to take my word for it. Thanks again for joining us today. We'll see you again next time on the next episode of Percussion 101 with Mr. Lupoli.